Hello everyone and welcome back to MixBuzz TV mixing and mastering tutorials on YouTube. I'm your host David, and in this video I want to talk about eq'ing parallel channels. Specifically the potential problems of eq'ing parallel channels, whether that is a parallel compression channel, parallel saturation, etc. Not effects, and specifically not time-based effects like delays or reverbs, and I'll explain you why those don't fall in the same category in a minute. I see quite some confusion about eq'ing parallel channels. The question is if you should do that, how to do that, and if that would cause problems or not. So the first thing to address is the difference between a phase shift and an actual phase problem. With phase problem, we usually mean one or more portion of the frequency spectrum that get cancelled, reduced in power and amplitude. And that cancellation is caused by a phase shift that happens after the recording, at the mixing stage when manipulating with EQ two signals coming from the same source, like for example kick in and kick out, bass amp and bass DI, or by multing a track for parallel processing like compression for example, and then EQing this parallel channel. Should you EQ the parallel channel? Will it cause any phase issue? How to deal with that if it does? So let's try to clear this up. A phase shift can happen without it causing any problem. Phase shift actually happens all the time when we EQ. That's normal, that's not a problem, it's how EQ works. But a phase problem is pretty much always caused by a phase shift. So you see the difference. The phase shift can happen without causing a problem, but the phase problem is most likely always caused by the phase shift. So we said any EQ move will cause a phase shift to some degree. That's understood, that is not a problem 99% of the time. But when we talk about EQing a parallel channel, that phase shift does cause a problem and cancellation between the parallel channel and the dry signal. There's no maybe, there's no doubt about it. What we have to decide is if we can live with that cancellation, if the benefits of EQing the parallel channel outweigh the downsides. Practical example, we mult a kick, send it to a bus, parallel compress it, and then EQ the parallel channel. That will cause a phase shift, which will cause cancellation. Where and how will depend obviously on what frequency you adjust with your EQ on the parallel channel and to what degree. Same goes for vocals, drum bus, bass, everything you mult, send it to a bus and compress or saturate, etc. When there's no change in timing, when the two signals are still synced and you EQ one of them, that will cause a phase shift. And I already feel what some people are going to say, I EQ my parallel channel all the time and I have no problems. Yeah, me too. And it's totally possible, but not because there's no phase shift. You have no problems because whether or not you realize it, you compensate for the phase cancellation while mixing, whether it is with level or more EQ, or simply by using the phase shift as a form of equalization. Again, whether you realize this or not. The problem with that is that for those who are not aware of the phase shift happening with EQ in a parallel channel, the effect can be unpredictable and could potentially create a hole in the mix that would be hard, if not impossible, to solve without knowing what's really happening. And as usual, this kind of phase problems are more noticeable and more problematic on low frequencies and elements that have a lot of energy in the low end like kick, bass, but also vocals. So let's go to Pro Tools and have a listen. I have this acoustic drum here recorded. Let's have a listen. Okay, nothing special. So we have a kick, snare, hi-hats, overheads, blah, blah, blah. This is gonna be just an example. So let's say we are happy with the overall sound of the drum kit. We just want more punch for the kick drum. And we do something pretty common, which is sending the kick to a parallel compression channel. Now, let's add the parallel compression, which right now has no processing whatsoever on it. So compression is bypassed, EQ is bypassed. Let's try to flip the phase without doing anything with our EQ first. What we have is a complete cancellation. all right? So the two channels, the dry kick drum and the parallel aux, are canceling each other because there is a polarity flip with no processing whatsoever. So it's like we are copying our kick drum. Now with our parallel channel with the phase flipped, if we add the compressor, what we're gonna hear is the difference in dynamic. This is what the compressor is doing. If we take the EQ out, so the phase flip out, this is our kick drum with the parallel compression. Nothing strange so far. Without it, we do have more punch, all right? So this being an example, let's say we like the punch, but we have too much low end. Our first instinct would be to cut the low end out from the parallel compression channel. Why? Because if the low end was fine before, now it's too much. Our first instinct would be to cut the low end here. And this goes for a parallel channel, but it goes for a multi-mic'd kick drum as well. Let's hear what happens when I start to EQ my parallel compression channel. So let's unbypass our EQ and start to cut the low end. Bypass first. You hear that? It sucks out all the low end. You will say, yes, it's cutting the low end. Yeah. But what's happening is it's not cutting the low end according to my HPF settings alone. What's happening on top of my low cut is the phase cancellation between the dry kick and the EQ'd compressed parallel channel. And that's gonna be obvious if I flip the polarity. Let's flip the phase and hear that. You hear this? This is what is getting canceled with the EQ. If I flip the phase back, if I take the parallel compression channel out, there's more bottom. Now listen, if I make the filter steeper, the cancellation is gonna be more obvious. This is what I'm canceling right now. You hear that? If I move the I-pass. You'll notice that if I'm cutting higher and I go above the fundamental frequency of the kick drum, the bottom comes back. Here is canceled almost completely. Here comes back. So as you can see, one way to solve this problem is to set your high-pass filter to where it actually works for us instead of against us. To set the high-pass to a point where the cancellation is actually useful. For example, here in the 250 range. It makes the kick deeper. You hear? The low end is still there. But if I cut around 70 or 80, it sucks out everything. Flip the phase. This is what I'm canceling. Now this is what I'm canceling. This might be useful. I can use the phase cancellation to my advantage. So when you EQ your parallel compression channel, you need to pay attention obviously to low-end content elements with a strong energy in the low end, because this is what happens. You know, by EQing your parallel compression channel or parallel anything, you create some phase cancellation. Where and how it's important. You can EQ your parallel compression channel, but you need to be aware of what's happening, of what's going on, and use the side effects, if you will, to your advantage, like in this case. Because when you cut, let's say at 50 or 60 on a kick drum like this example, you're not just cutting the energy below 50 or 60 in the parallel channel. It's the combination of the dry kick and the parallel compression channel EQ'd that creates cancellation. The overall result is a drop in energy. And of course, the other option is not to EQ the parallel compression channel, but to EQ the source. So instead of EQing our parallel compression channel, let's say we have too much bottom end with the parallel compression, and again, this is just an example, we EQ the source. This way, there's no phase cancellation between the two, because it's the source that has less low end to begin with. Or if you want more, again, there's no phase shift between the dry kick and the parallel compression channel. So EQing the source is always the best option. And like I said, some people instinctively compensate for that with levels. Phase cancellation is also level dependent, let's not forget that. And by tweaking the EQ, and that is fine, we all do that. But still, it's risky. And like I said, sometimes unpredictable, especially with high track counts. These kind of problems are more obvious on the low-end elements, so to EQ the source would be always my first choice for things like kick and bass. But many times with other sources, like vocals, for example, and bass too, we like to distort and saturate in parallel, or warp the sound some way, and that includes EQing it pretty heavily. And especially when we distort, usually we don't want the whole spectrum to be either saturated or injected back into the mix. A common example would be a radio-y distorted vocal or a growling distorted bass. In most of those cases, it's not an option not to EQ the parallel channel, and it's not an option to EQ the source in that way either, because often on those type of sounds, we end up with a very narrow bandpass type of EQ. And EQing the source like that is really not an option. It would change the source way too much. In those cases, there's no other way other than EQ in the parallel channel. So these are some cases in which we simply deal with a phase shift, with a phase cancellation, and compensate for that. What I suggest is, if for example we are bandpassing the parallel signal, to pay attention to the corner frequencies we pick. And for bass, for example, to go high enough with the HPF so that we are away from the low range that could possibly be cancelled, or where we could create a nasty deep on one of the fundamental frequencies where the power is. And for elements like vocals, guitars, synths that live in the mid, to move around our filters until we find a sweet spot. This way we can actually use the phase shift, the phase cancellation, as a form of EQ, not only for the parallel channel, but also for the source. We have to monitor the two together. Makes sense? I hope it does. Also, you can always try a linear phase EQ on the parallel channel, which sometimes works very well. And like I mentioned before, this doesn't really apply to effects like delays and reverbs, especially with the long pre-delays for reverbs, because by shifting the parallel channel in time, you don't have that strict phase correlation between the dry signal and the effects channel no more. Although with very short delays and verbs, it does. I'm sure you've heard many times how effects can change the overall sound, and I'm sure many times you found yourself doing your final EQ moves, for example on vocals, after you added a verb or a delays or a double. And that's also why, not just because the effect itself changes the overall sound, but because of the different EQ and phase correlation between the dry and the wet signal. Again, specifically with short time-based effects. So this is it for this video. I hope it was useful and I hope you liked it. If you did, please don't forget to click the like button. Every like counts. And if you have any questions on this subject or anything else, leave it in the comment box down below. Join us on Facebook and Twitter to keep in touch with us, ask questions, enter our giveaways, and stay updated with all the news, the upcoming series and videos. Please keep supporting MixBuzz TV by sharing the videos and linking the channel on social media, Facebook pages, blogs, and forums. Subscribe if you haven't already, and see you next time.